Okay, it's about 3:05, guys. Why don't we get started?
3:05.
Well, that's about right for a tournament, right? A little late, a little making sure everyone can get in. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Stefan Clausen. I'm a level 3 from Hilo, Hawaii, and we're on the Mystical Tutor team. We're hoping to host these live sessions all across the United States in hopefully reasonable time periods and time zones for everyone, so that we can sort of teach people about Magic the Gathering a little bit and some of the rules and helping people to become judges or just become better judges. Just a quick note beforehand, in the participation box you can mute yourself if you're hooked up to a speaker, and if you haven't hooked up yet you can go to the Quick Start tab at the top left and do call using computer. We'll be muting everybody during the presentations itself, and we ask that people use the chat box at that point. The chat box is below. Just do make sure that you have the send to everyone if you're messaging the entire group. Otherwise, you can send messages privately to each other if you need to. Just make sure you're sending it specifically however you need. Basically, what we hope to do with these Mystical Tutor sessions is run through the presentations, which you all have access to on the mysticaltutor.org website. But we'd also like to go over them and give some opportunity for everyone to have some discussion about the rules, hopefully learn a little more, and then possibly interact with each other too, just meeting judges from all around the world, making it sort of, continue the judge family idea. With that, why don't we just start the first Prezi and let people observe and listen. And I will be muting everybody.
Welcome to Mystical Tutor. These are a series of short 5 to 15 minute classes designed to help improve your knowledge of the rules and policies of the Magic the Gathering Judge Program. You can use this to help you become a better judge, become a judge in the first place, or just to improve your rules knowledge. We will be covering core rules concepts like the stack and priority, taking a turn, casting spells, keyword actions and abilities, state-based actions, activated and triggered abilities, and more. We will also be talking about the Judge Program in general, tournament logistics, judge behaviors and strategies, leveling up as a judge, and how to get the most out of your experience in the program. We hope Mystical Tutor will enlighten your journey through the world of competitive Magic. Let's talk about what a judge is and the roles different levels in the Judge Program occupy. The Judge Program is a community of passionate, motivated, and knowledgeable Magic the Gathering experts. Sure, we run tournaments, but we are also committed to helping each other grow and improve. Through community projects like this one, conferences, forums, and one-to-one reviews, we work to make each other better. A good judge is certainly knowledgeable, but eager to learn, friendly, open to criticism, and approachable. Judges in the program are divided into 5 different levels. At level 1, you can expect to run smaller local events like a Friday Night Magic or pre-release, educate newer players on complicated rules interactions or tournament policies, provide excellent customer service, and generally be the gatekeeper between many players experience casually at the kitchen table and their first competitive event. At level 2, you can work major events like a Grand Prix or Star City Games Open, head judge larger local events like a pre-PTQ, and off the tournament floor grow the community through mentorship and certifying new level 1 judges. Level 3 judges can be seen leading a team at a Grand Prix, working on the floor of a Pro Tour, or head judging major regional events. Outside of the tournament floor, in addition to being leaders in the community, they're also the judges that certify level 1s to level 2. Once you get to level 4 and higher, these judges in the burgundy shirt can be seen head judging Grand Prix and other major events, and they are the leading voices on policy development and spheres in the judge community. So you want to become a judge? Great! Let's start at level 1. To become a level 1 judge, you'll want to find a level 2 or higher judge to mentor you. If you're having difficulty finding one, try checking at your local gaming store, or contact your regional coordinator to find the level 2 or higher closest to you. You'll want to be listed as the head judge for 2 sanctioned events. You'll have an interview with your mentor, and of course, you'll need to get a passing score on a written rules and policy test. Writing judge tests is something everybody in the program has lots of experience with, and there are many resources available to you to help you practice. At judge.wizards.com, they have a wealth of practice tests of varying difficulty. You can check out the Judge Wiki at wiki.magicjudges.org. Playing lots and lots of magic never hurts, and of course there's always Mystical Tutor. Once you become a level 1, there are plenty of resources available to you to help you grow and participate in the global judge community. At apps.magicjudges.org, you can engage with the forums and apply for events. You can check out the regular podcasts at JudgeCast, hang out at the MTG Rules IRC, and of course, you can always improve your rules knowledge with the Cranial Insertion blog and the hyperlinked Yogg-Togg Comp Rules. Thanks for checking out this first session of Mystical Tutor. Hope to see you next time.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. Just had a quick knock on my door. There will be a test, actually, which is kind of amusing. That was just basically the intro to our first of the basic Mystical Tutor program itself, which is sort of the intro on judging and that sort of thing. Next, we'll be going over today's sessions. Will be permanence, cards, states, and zones, priority, and then mana abilities as well. From what I've been told, that it's not really working for whatever reason on mobile phone right now, so we will try and figure something else out. But otherwise, we will be posting this hopefully on YouTube or in some other way that's accessible for people later. Do remember, too, that if you want to, you can watch all these prezzies at mysticaltutor.org later in case it isn't working for us, unfortunately. So next, I guess before we get started, does anyone have any questions?
I have one. Is it necessary to find a level 2 to mentor you, or is it okay to find a level 1 to mentor you and then find a level 2 to
You'll actually need a level 2 to certify you, to actually go through the test and make sure, but it's definitely possible for level 1s to help you get on the way, to learn the ways of becoming a judge, the basic policy and procedures you need to learn, and the magic rules. So level 1 can definitely help get you there, but you do need level 2 or higher to eventually take the test and be certified. But, I mean, in my area, I've gotten several level 1s who have found L0 candidates who are interested in testing, and so they learn alongside that level 1 at the time, and then eventually come to me or another level 2 to try and get closer to it.
Thank you.
Okay. If there are no other questions, why don't we move on to our first actual educational presentation, permanent states, cards, and zones. Once again, muting everybody for the session.
Welcome to Mystical Tutor. Our journey on the road to judging takes us to permanents, cards, states, and zones today. Permanents are cards or tokens on the battlefield. There are 5 different types of permanents: creatures, lands, artifacts, enchantments, and planeswalkers. A permanent can have more than one type, such as artifact land or enchantment creature. Permanents can have supertypes or subtypes that augment the card type. These cannot stand alone. Some examples of supertypes are legendary, basic, and token. Different types of permanents have their own set of subtypes. Creatures have subtypes such as human, vampire, bird, and kraken. Lands have subtypes such as mountain, forest, urzas, and gate. Artifacts usually have the subtype equipment, while enchantments have subtypes such as aura and curse. Another kind of permanent is a token. Tokens are markers that represent any permanent that is not represented by a card. We usually think of tokens as creatures. However, this is not always the case, such as a landmine token created by Goblin Kaboomist, or a gold token created by Guild. Other objects that are not permanents include emblems and spells on the stack, including instants and sorceries. Permanents have a status, which is its physical state. There are 4 status categories, each of which have 2 possible values: tapped or untapped, face up or face down, flipped or unflipped, and phased in or phased out. Permanents always have one of the values of each of the statuses. Permanents enter the battlefield by default untapped, face up, unflipped, and phased in. A permanent status is not a characteristic, though it may affect a permanent's characteristics. Transform is not a status of a permanent, as not all cards can be transformed. If a non-double-faced card attempts to transform, it will fail. Double-faced cards also have no face-down side, though they can be face-down due to manifest. Zones are areas in the game of Magic. They are places where objects can be, and they assist players in keeping cards and concepts separate. Zones can be public or hidden, and there are 8 zones in total. There are 2 private zones, which not all players can be expected to see the cards' faces: the library and the hand. A player's library is their deck, which is kept in a single face-down pile. If an effect puts 2 or more cards on either the top or bottom of a library at the same time, the owner may arrange those cards in any order and does not reveal the order to the other players. Some effects reveal the top card of a library, or allow a player to look at the top card of a library. If the top card changes during the casting of the spell, then the top of the library will not be revealed, and cannot be looked at until the spell is cast. A player's hand is the primary source of cards they can play. Each player has a maximum hand size, which is usually 7, and has to discard at the end of the turn if they have more than the maximum. The other 6 zones are all public zones, meaning they are shared by both players, and they both are entitled access to view the objects in the zones. The graveyard is a player's discard pile, which is kept in a single face-up pile. When an object is countered, discarded, destroyed, or sacrificed, it is placed in its owner's graveyard. Additionally, instant and sorcery spells move to the graveyard at the end of their resolution. While players can examine cards in any graveyard, they normally cannot change the order of the cards. There are additional rules for DCI-sanctioned tournaments that may allow a player to change the order of their graveyard. Similar to the library, if 2 or more cards are placed into a graveyard at the same time, they may be rearranged in any order. The battlefield is where all permanents reside. While there is no set method for organizing permanents, it is important to not hide any information from an opponent. The stack is a zone where all spells go when they are cast, and where abilities are placed when they are activated or triggered. For spells, the physical card is placed on the stack. For abilities, they are placed on the stack with no physical representation. Some abilities and actions do not use the stack, such as mana abilities, state-based actions, special actions, static abilities, and turn-based actions. More information on the stack will be covered in the subsequent lesson. The Exile Zone is a holding area for objects. Some spells and abilities send objects to exile permanently, while other spells and abilities exile objects temporarily. Cards in the Exile Zone are face-up by default, and can be viewed by any player. Certain spells or abilities exile cards face down, and they may not be examined by any player except when instructions allow it. The Command Zone is a game area reserved for certain objects that have an overarching effect on the game, but they are not permanent and cannot be destroyed. In certain casual variants, such as Planner Magic, Vanguard, EDH, and Arch Enemy, non-traditional Magic cards, or specially designated cards, start the game in the Command Zone. Each variant has its own rules regarding these cards. The final zone is the Anti-Zone, but we will not worry about this zone. Cards with certain card types cannot enter certain zones. If an instant or sorcery card tries to enter the battlefield, it stays in the previous zone. If a plain, Vanguard, or Scheme card would leave the Command Zone, it stays in the Command Zone. If an object moves from one zone to another, it is a new object that has no memory or relation to its previous form. However, there are some exceptions. If the characteristics of a permanent spell are changed by an effect, then it will still be applied to the permanent the spell becomes. Any damage prevention effects on a permanent spell are continued to be applied to the permanent the spell becomes. If an ability on a permanent requires information about choices made as the permanent was cast as a spell, it uses the information about the spell. If an ability triggers when an object changes zones, it can find the new object in the zone where the ability triggered, if the zone is public. Abilities of auras that trigger when the enchanted permanent leaves the battlefield can find the new object that aura became in its owner's graveyard, if it was put into that graveyard at the same time the enchanted permanent left the battlefield. It can also find the new object that aura became in its owner's graveyard as a result of being put there as a state-based action for not being attached to a permanent. If an effect grants a non-land card an ability that allows it to be cast, the ability will continue to apply to the new object that card became after it moved to the stack as a result of being cast this way. This concludes today's Mystical Tutor. We hope to see you next time.
Okay, and so that was our presentation on permanents, cards, states, and zones. We hope it was relatively informative. We've had a couple of latecomers in, so just a quick reminder again that all these prezzies can be found at mysticaltutor.org. The link should be in our chat box, but we can repeat it again before the end. So that if you actually want to see these presentations again or review some of this information, you can always find it online there. As for now, as we said, it is going to be quizzed for this live session here. So we have a couple challenge questions for you guys in a little bit. But before we get started on that, does anyone have any questions on permanents, cards, states, or zones? I think we saw a few in the chat box. Okay, let's 1 second. Okay, the first question was, I saw in chat box whether tokens are super types, and while the audio does say that, that is actually incorrect. We managed to fix the text, but not the audio at that point, so we may have to eventually re-record this. So tokens are not actually super types. Card, they're not counted in a list of super types. The second question was whether transformed is a state, and that is also not affirmative. It is not a state. Things like flipped or tapped can be states, but not transformed, because not every sort of card could be transformed. Finally, placement of cards. There's no actual current placement of cards except for on coverage at the Pro Tour, so players can still arrange their board states, their battlefields, however they wish, as long as things remain in one recognizable pile. Let's see. The next question I saw from Not a Balloon is, so Sleight of Mind could be cast on a creature spell, and the creature would enter the effect of Sleight. Okay, here are several questions, so hold on a second. Let me see if I can pull up the text for everyone for Sleight of Mind.
In regard to the emblems question, the emblems are in the command zone and they're not targetable by boomerangs. Essentially, for the most part, emblems are permanent for the rest of the game, unless the game restarts. But that's a corner case. I believe so. I've never been in a game that would happen, but I would imagine restarting the game would clear the command zone.
Yes, emblems are in the command zones, and there's pretty much nothing that can interact with them except for maybe restarting the entire game. Yes, if you restart a game with Karn, for instance, it would erase the emblem because the entire game is starting over. Here's the text for Sleight of Mind. It's a text-changing ability on the spell, and so it can't actually change the color of permanents. It can only change the text. Notice it says change the text to target spell or permanent, so it can only change cards that have color words in them. So something that says protection from red, for instance, could be changed in that sense.
Are you asking if I Sleight of Mind with Goblin Pile Driver on the stack? Are you asking if you can change the protection until it comes into the battlefield and it would say like protection from white or something like that? Correct. Pile Driver's protection only functions when it's on the battlefield.
I believe what he's asking actually is would that carry over once that hit the battlefield after it resolved?
Right, so if you change the text of a spell, which is to become a permanent, the permanent will retain that text change until the effect wears off. So if while in the stack you cast Sleight of Mind, changing green or blue to green, let's say, until end of turn, right? Sleight of Mind is an end of turn, or no, it's permanent. Neat. So you can target it while it's on the stack and make sure that the protection from blue is now protection from green, for example. A lot of times Gatherer rulings are a great resource to use because it's right in the Gatherer rulings on the bottom there. It says if you change the text of a spell which has become a permanent, then the permanent will retain that text change until the effect wears off. And yes, I also learned that today, that Sleight of Mind is apparently permanent.
And here's the actual Gatherer link for you guys too to take a look at if you need to.
Also, hi everyone, I'm James Evelyn. I'm the other person behind
Yes.
all this. I'm the
Sorry, I
one running
forgot
the video.
question.
It's okay, everybody always forgets about me. Alright, do we have any other questions before we move on to our next video?
Yeah, we have to do the priority permanents and cards questions first. 2 people. Okay.
Moving over.
Okay, so we have a couple challenge questions for you guys. Here's the first one.
Alright, so the question that we've got here is, with a Corsair Crewfix out, when Bob casts a Brainstorm, does he get to flip over the top card of his library after drawing the third card before making a decision about which cards to put back on top? So I saw somebody said he has to wait until Brainstorm's resolution. I also saw the fourth card on the library is never the top card, so it doesn't flip. Does anybody have any other different ideas before we... So Quentin makes a good point. His opponent does get to see the 3 cards he draws, though, because they are revealed as he draws them. So that's correct. So would he be able to see the 4th card?
So I guess the question becomes, do continuous abilities happen through the effect of a spell?
Hey guys, sorry, we're just having a little bit of technical difficulties for a second there. Could you repeat that question again?
I think the real question is, do continuous abilities happen through the effect of the spell?
They do continue to happen through the effects of the spell. That's also why when you do individual actions of drawing cards like Brainstorm, you do get to or you do have to reveal every single card you draw. One interesting thing too, just to remember, is you put 2 cards back on any order, but since you're putting them back, you're not actually revealing them as you put them back.
So you only have to reveal the top card to your opponent. They don't know what the second card down is. Now, I see people talking about Scry, and
Which
well,
is-
we got more coursers to talk about. So, continued from our last question, what about the card on top of Bob's library while resolving the Scry 4 of 4C? The 4C says Scry 4, then draw 2 cards, and we all know what Courser does. So, if we're looking at the top 4 cards of my library, let's say I'm Bob, do we look at the 5th one down as well? So I'm seeing a few answers come in, and they are correct. So Scry specifically just states that we look at the top 4 cards of our library. So we're not actually putting those. The top card isn't changing. Now, once we finish scrying, we'll still have to reveal the 2 cards that are drawn because they are on top of the library, if that makes sense. Thumbs up, thumbs down. No, we had a lot of questions given to us, so we only picked a few. So we forgot to take out the continued from 3. That is our fault.
Yeah. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. Final question for this section.
Artemisia attacks with a face-down Death Mist Raptor, and before damage, pays the Megamorph cost on Death Mist Raptor to turn it face up. Is it tapped or untapped, and why? I think everyone got that one pretty easily. Right, so changing which side is face up or face down doesn't change the other parts of the object. It doesn't leave play and come back in face up or anything like that. So it's still tapped and attacking and face up. Good job, everyone.
An interesting concept that Jonathan brought up is if Bob is scrying and reveals cards 2, 3, and 4 because they think they're supposed to on top of the library, is there a penalty, and what's the judge call?
That is an interesting question. I'd agree with you. He doesn't have a right to reveal that information, unfortunately, because it is hidden.
Okay, so everyone got the tabs in. So,
before we move on, Squee, the Origin Chandra can't be considered face down because double-sided cards can never be turned face down. Okay, so now we'll be moving into...
What is her status as flipped or unflipped then? If she has to keep one of the 4, if she has to keep one set of all the 4 states.
So, for example, if Ixodron came in and said, when Ixodron comes into play, it turns all creatures face down, it just won't. If that makes sense. And if you manifest a double face card, it'll be manifested and you can turn it face up, if I remember correctly, but it doesn't have its face. It's just a 2/2. These are. Oh, I'm glad we haven't had to deal with these yet. Questions.
yeah, you can something. Think of it. Turns for what if it's a plan, it'll become flips up, manifested. And of course, you could transform your bonus. Okay. A few technical difficulties, guys, so bear with us. We'll try and repeat things. Oh, is it mine? It could be my mic. I'll try and mute my. Okay, retesting my mic at this point. Thanks, Joe. Okay, so before we move on, are there any other questions about permanents, cards, states, or zones?
So the mic broke up when you were answering the question about say like the double-faced planeswalkers. What is their status?
Oh, okay. Well, let me type it into the chat. That might be a little easier.
What a complicated standard set.
If Chandra is face down, and attacks for 2, will she remember the damage when she's flipped back up? I guess turned face up.
Yes, it will. It does keep all damage and things attached to it. It's just changing like its form basically. So it's becoming from the 2/2. It becomes the actual Chandra and track how much damage it's dealt and how much damage it's taken. Okay. I think that's relatively decent coverage. Why don't we move on to the next presentation, guys?
Hello, and welcome to Mystical Tutor. These are a series of 5 to 15-minute classes designed to help improve your knowledge of the rules and policies of the Magic the Gathering Judge program. This lesson will focus on the core concepts of priority and the stack. In Magic, we need a system to indicate when each player can take game actions. Without it, we have chaos, arguments over who cast a spell or when an ability happened. This system is called priority. This means that there is never a point in the game where both players can take an action at the same time. Priority is like a talking stick. It gets passed back and forth between players, and you're not allowed to take actions without it. The active player receives priority whenever a spell or ability is put on the stack, whenever a spell or ability resolves, or after a turn-based action is performed. The non-active player receives priority whenever the active player is done taking their actions and passes priority. The active player is the person whose turn it is. Shockingly, the non-active player is the other player. The active player receives priority because something happened and the game gave it to them. If the active player chooses to do nothing, they pass priority, and the non-active player receives it. If the active player takes an action, they receive priority again. If the non-active player takes an action, casting a spell, activating an ability, or using a special action, the active player receives priority immediately afterwards. If the non-active player chooses to not take an action, they pass priority. Then, since both players have passed priority without taking an action, if there is a spell or ability on the stack, the top object on the stack resolves. If there isn't a spell or ability on the stack, the step or phase ends. As discussed in the lesson, permanents, cards, states, and zones, the stack is the zone where spells and abilities go while they are waiting to resolve. The stack keeps track of the order of objects that are added to it. Each time an object is put on the stack, it is put on top of all objects already there. An easy way to visualize this is to imagine a pile of cards with the most recent spell on the top. When you cast a card, the first thing you do is move it to the stack. The card will physically move to the stack and will become a spell. It is not a spell anywhere else. The card will physically move to the stack and will become a spell. It is not a spell anywhere else. Even instants and sorceries are not spells, unless they're on the stack. Abilities don't have a card associated with them, so they don't have physical representation. Abilities on the stack are not spells. Each spell on the stack has all the characteristics of the card associated with it. For example, Siege Rhino is a green, white, black creature spell with converted mana cost 4. Abilities only have the text of the ability that created it. However, the game knows the characteristics of the object that created the ability. The controller of a spell or ability is the person who cast the spell, activated the ability, or controls the card with the triggered ability. Spells and abilities leave the stack in one of 4 ways. 1. Being moved to any other zone by an effect. For example, Venser, Schaefer Savant, can return a spell to its owner's hand. 2. Being countered by a spell or ability, such as Dissolve. 3. Being countered by a game rule, for example if it doesn't have any legal targets. 4. Resolving. A spell or ability that is countered is put into its owner's graveyard and none of its effects occur. When a spell or ability resolves, its effects occur in the order they are written, but we'll go into more detail on that later. The most recent spell or ability on the stack will be the first spell or ability to resolve when both players pass priority in succession without taking an action. There is no way to keep your opponent from being able to respond to your spell or ability. Even if you keep casting spells or activating abilities, if you want them to resolve, you eventually have to pass priority to your opponent. Thanks for checking out this episode of Mystical Tutor. We hope to see you next time.
Okay. So that was our questions. So, before we move to our challenge questions, do we have any questions on priority in the stack? Let's see. So Chance has a question here that asks if certain cards, like command cards, like commands, have 2 targets, if one of them becomes legal, then it could still resolve. And the answer is yes. If a spell has multiple targets, like modal cards, as long as there is still 1 legal target remaining, the entire spell will still go through, unless every target on it is illegal. Holding priority is an interesting thing. So the question was, what does it mean when you hold priority? Holding priority is something you sometimes do. Players don't do it too often, but it gives you an option. If you need to do multiple things at the same time before your opponent gets a chance to respond, you can tell your opponent, or the player can tell their opponent, that they want to hold priority. Say, I need to use a pump spell on one of my creatures, and then also cast a burn spell to keep something else alive. I can say hold priority and put 2 things on the stack before my opponent gets a chance to respond.
If you ask to hold priority, they can't interrupt it with another instant.
They can't, actually. By game rules, the active player, or whoever had priority, gets technically the active player gets priority again. So after something goes on the stack or resolves, the person who always gets priority is active player. But if you have priority, you can ask, or you can hold priority again to do something, and they can't respond until you're done putting things on the stack if you'd like. However, this also means they can interrupt everything. Yes, sorry, I misspoke there. You do get priority back necessarily every time you finish something, if you want to hold priority. So if you're, say, the non-active player, you get to put it back on the stack. Or sorry, you get to have the option to put something back on the stack again. Let's see, the next questions. Yes, the question that Tony asked about holding priority and putting a spell a split second on, the problem is your opponent still gets a chance to have priority before the spell resolves after the split second spell resolves. Oh yeah, the Niv Magus example that Squee puts up here is a very good one. You need to hold priority to exile your own spell, if otherwise your opponent can pass and let it resolve. Okay, so James, if you could switch us to the next set of questions for people. Okay, it looks like pretty much everyone got this question. When you start casting a spell, and the steps to casting a spell, if you have to pay additional costs, that's in the spell itself. So again, nobody gets priority in the middle of casting a spell. As some people have said that you can't respond to paying costs or things. It's basically the fully in order steps to casting a spell. So you guys pretty much all got that one. Does it make sense to everyone? I think exactly. Okay, let's move on to the next question then. James, do you want to present this one? Is your mic working?
I'll certainly try.
Okay.
All right. During Andrea's main phase, Andrea casts Liliana Vess. Nina allows Liliana to resolve and enter the battlefield, but wants to cast Fated Conflagration targeting Liliana before Andrea has an opportunity to use any of Liliana's abilities. Is that play legal? All right, so I see a lot of answers here, and most of them are correct. Mostly everybody said no. Andrea cannot do this unless, or I'm sorry, Nina cannot cast Fated Conflagration before Andrea has an opportunity to activate one of the abilities. Now, of course, if she did something else before it, if she cast Liliana Vess and then wanted to cast, for example, Murder, then they could respond with Fated Conflagration on Liliana, but they will not receive priority. If Andrea wants to use an ability of Liliana Vess, she can. They can respond to it, but the counters are put on to Liliana as part of the cost. So if she uses the +1 ability of Liliana Vess, target player discards a card, she'll be at 6 loyalty before Fated Conflagration can even be cast. Lands are a special action, and they do not use the stack, so no, they cannot be responded to, unless the land has a triggered ability like Scry Temple or things of that nature. Courser is a continuous effect. It's a static ability, so that is always happening. So, but if like you play a land and they gain a life, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the triggered ability, not the play with the top card of the library. Yeah, I got that. Sorry. Yes, the life gain is a trigger and could be responded to. So if Andrea played Liliana and then decided to play a land and had a Courser out, Nina could Fated Conflagration to kill the Liliana Vess before Liliana's ability could be activated. That's my fault. Okay. And yes, Planeswalkers cannot activate abilities unless the stack is empty and only at sorcery speed during the player's turn. Unless, of course, they have Teferi, Temporal Master, whatever his name is emblem, but that's corner case, and we're not going to talk about that. All right, so let's move on to, I believe there's one more question correct in the priority in the stack. So Nadi controls Ryusei the Falling Star, and his opponent Allison controls a Tukathung Thallid. If Allison casts Fated Retribution on her turn, does the Saproing made by the Thallid's triggered ability survive the Dragon's triggered ability? Does that answer change if Allison casts Fated Retribution on her opponent's turn? We will get the text for Fated Retribution right now. The gist of it is it destroys all creatures and planeswalkers, and if it's your turn, scry 2. It does depend on whose turn it is. That's correct. Triggers do go on the stack in active player, non-active player order, or app nap, as you can see in the chat. So, Why does somebody want to write down what happens if Allison caps Fated Retribution on her turn? And walk through the triggers. So if Allison starts by casting Fated Retribution, the Tugathung Thallid and the Ryusei, yes, the active player has the Tugathung Thallid. So if we cast Fated Retribution on our turn, we have two triggered abilities, Tugathung Thallids and Ryuseis, and they'll go on the stack in active player, non-active player order. So Tugathung Thallid's ability will go on the stack, and then Ryusei's ability will also go on the stack. And then we'll go last in, first out. So Ryusei's will resolve first to burn everything, and then Tugathung Thallid's will resolve, putting a Saproling into play. Right? So now that switches, of course, if we change whose turn it is. So if Allison casts Fated Retribution on her opponent's turn, the triggers go on the stack in the opposite direction. So first Ryusei's will go on, and then Tugathung Thallid's. So same thing, last in, first out. Tugathung Thallid's ability will resolve, putting a Saproling into play, and then Ryusei's will kill everything, and that poor little Saproling will be burned alive. Okay, so that's just how abilities go on the stack when there are multiple triggered abilities that happen at the same time. It's just important to remember that the active players will go on the stack first, and then the non-active players will go on the stack, and they'll resolve from the top to the bottom. Okay, are there any other questions we have, and before we move on to our final Prezi for today's Mystical Tutor section? Holding priority needs to be declared as you're casting the spell. In most tournaments, if a player holds priority, they just choose to say, I'm casting this, but I'm going to hold priority. You can't see if your opponent's going to do something and then say, oh, wait, I'm holding priority.
Yeah. James, there's one more question actually in priority in the stack.
Oh, there is? Oh, yeah. Neato. I forget. Yes, Siege Rhinos. In his first main phase with the stack empty, Andrew decides to do nothing and says combat. Nolan says okay. Andrew then decides that, still in his main phase, he would like to cast Siege Rhino. Nolan tells him that it is too late to cast Siege Rhino in his first main phase. Who's correct and why? All right, so everybody is saying that we've moved into combat, and that's correct. So when we talk about tournament shortcuts in more detail, one of the most commonly accepted one is saying combat or attackers or things like that. This means that we have already, if I say combat to my opponent and they say, okay, that means I'm saying I'm passing priority until we get to the declare attacks or to the beginning of combat then. As to how acceptable, it matters. Usually when most players say combat, they mean declare attackers. That's changed a little bit because, or at least that's what I mean when I say it, with Goblin Rabblemaster being a beginning at combat step. Yeah, of course. Everybody loves Rabblemaster. Butchering it, if that's more of a question of things. If this is a competitive REL event and my opponent says combat and I say okay, and they say, no, wait, I want to cast the Siege Rhino, I'm telling them they can't. Because he's passed priority to me. So. If no one casted an instant, then yes, he would still have priority in the main phase. Because both players didn't pass with the stack being empty. if you go combat no wait, then we're getting too far off track here. But basically, in this scenario, he saw that his opponent wasn't going to do anything, so we moved on to combat. So that's where we'll leave that for now because we are trying to run a little bit long. So we have to continue on to our last Prezi. So. Okay, so now we're going to be moving into our last Prezi, which is mana abilities, and often one of the most fun parts of Magic is mana abilities, so we'll be taking a look at this. Once everybody gets muted, I will start the video. Make sure you can talk and ask questions through the text chat if need be. All right, I will mute myself so that way nobody hears me.
Hello and welcome to Mystical Tutor. These are a series of 5 to 15-minute classes designed to help improve your knowledge of the rules and policies of the Magic the Gathering Judge program. This lesson will be on mana abilities. We will go over what the definition of a mana ability is, how mana abilities can be activated, how mana abilities resolve, and some special cases with some specific types of mana abilities. So, I'm sure you've heard the term mana ability before. There are even some cards that specifically reference mana abilities. But what exactly is a mana ability? Well, it's just about how it sounds. A mana ability is an activated ability that puts mana into a player's mana pool. Any triggered ability that produces mana and triggers from an activated mana ability is also a mana ability. So now that we know what a mana ability is, what about what a mana ability isn't? There are some exceptions to this definition of a mana ability, and they are as follows. The first exception for mana abilities is that mana abilities cannot have targets. That means if the word target is anywhere in the ability's text, it will not be a mana ability. Take Deathrite Shaman's first ability, for example. It reads, exile target land card from a graveyard. Add wood mana of any color to your mana pool. Even though the targeting part seems separate from the mana part of the ability, it's still all one ability. And since this ability targets, it is not a mana ability. Some abilities ask you to choose something, like Spectral Searchlight. Spectral Searchlight says, choose a player. That player adds 1 mana of any color he or she chooses to his or her mana pool. Choosing something is not targeting, so this ability does not target, and therefore is a mana ability. The second exception for mana abilities is that mana abilities cannot be Planeswalker loyalty abilities. As of this lesson, the only cards that this applies to are Xenagos the Reveler, Koth of the Hammer, and Sarkhan Unbroken. This exception really exists to prevent players from activating Planeswalker loyalty abilities at times they shouldn't normally be able to. Okay, so those are the exception for mana abilities, but there are also some things that may look like mana abilities, but are not mana abilities at all. The most common offenders for this category are something like Frontier Siege on Khans. While this is a triggered ability that adds mana, the source of the trigger is not a mana ability, making Frontier Siege's Khans ability not a mana ability. An example of when a triggered ability is a mana ability would be something like Heartbeat of Spring. Heartbeat of Spring triggers whenever a land taps for mana. So as long as each land's ability is a mana ability, so will the triggered ability from Heartbeat of Spring. There are also a lot of spells that generate mana. Mana abilities are specifically activated abilities and some triggered abilities, not spells. There are some older cards like Dark Ritual that had the type mana source printed on them, but have since received errata to become instant spells. Instant or sorcery spells cannot be mana abilities. They are just treated as normal spells on the stack and can be responded to just like any other spell. Similarly, Convoke and Delve are abilities that allow you to pay mana by doing something other than activating mana abilities. These abilities actually only affect the game during the pay cost step, not the activating mana ability step of casting a spell. They are also static abilities, not activated or triggered abilities, so that also means they cannot be mana abilities. Some mana abilities have additional effects. Take Elves of Deep Shadow for instance. Its mana ability reads, add black to your mana pool. Elves of Deep Shadow deals 1 damage to you. Well, this ability is an activated ability that produces mana and doesn't target, so it's definitely a mana ability. There are also some that make players draw cards, like Chromatic Sphere, or cause cards to move zones, like Deranged Assistant. All of these mana abilities are treated just the same as other mana abilities. They resolve in the same way and can be activated at the same times. So now we know what mana abilities are and are not. What happens when you activate mana abilities? Well, you activate them just the same as any other ability, except they do not use the stack. This means a few things, first of which is they cannot be responded to. This also means that the player who activated the ability retains priority. Sometimes a mana ability will trigger another ability that does not produce mana, like Vorinclex Voice of Hunger's second ability. When these abilities trigger, they go onto the stack the same time any other triggers would, the next time a player would receive priority. How about an example? Arthur controls Vorinclex Voice of Hunger, and Noreen controls Deathrite Shaman. Arthur casts Gulf Squid, which resolves, and he puts its trigger on the stack targeting Noreen. In response to the trigger, Noreen taps her 3 lands, triggering Vorinclex's ability 3 times. Noreen still has priority, and she wants to activate Deathrite Shaman's first ability targeting a land in her graveyard. Since Noreen would receive priority to do so, Vorinclex's triggered abilities are put onto the stack, and then she activates Deathrite Shaman's ability in response to those. While we're talking about activating mana abilities, let's go over when players can activate mana abilities. The first time is the most obvious, whenever a player has priority. As was said before, since mana abilities don't use the stack, the player who had priority when activating the mana ability will retain it even after it resolves. Another time when players can activate mana abilities is during the casting of a spell. There is a specific step in casting a spell just before paying costs where the player casting the spell can activate mana abilities. We will go over this in more detail during the lesson on casting a spell. Players may also activate mana abilities during the Declare Attackers and Declare Blockers steps in the combat phase. If you remember the lesson on the combat phase, you'll know that some creatures like Kalsizma Behemoth require a player to pay a cost as they're being declared as an attacker or a blocker. There are also some specific cards like Ghostly Prison that make a player pay costs if they are attacking a specific player. All of these costs are paid in the Declare Attackers and Declare Blocker steps before players receive priority. Similarly to casting a spell, there's an opportunity for attacking or blocking player to activate mana abilities just before you pay the costs. Okay, so now we know when you can activate mana abilities and how they resolve, but there's some strange cases with mana abilities. Like when a mana ability would produce no mana, for example. Let's say you have a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, but you have no devotion to white. When you activate Nykthos' ability for white, even though it produces no mana, it is still a mana ability. However, this will not trigger effects that look for tapping a land for mana like Verdant Haven. Basically, a mana ability remains a mana ability even if the game state would not allow it to produce mana, but the game still cares about what it actually produced. Producing 0 mana is different from not being able to produce mana, though. There are some cards that produce mana based on choices made or some other conditions. Let's take Meteor Crater for example. If you control Meteor Crater and no other permanents, then Meteor Crater cannot produce mana because you cannot choose a color of a permanent you control since Meteor Crater is colorless. Basically, if a mana ability would produce one or more mana of an undefined type, it will produce no mana instead. Some mana abilities produce mana based on what other permanents could produce, like Exotic Orchard. The mana this ability could produce is based on the mana it would generate if the ability were to resolve with the current game state. For example, if each player controls only Exotic Orchard, neither can produce mana. However, if a player controls Forest and an Orchard, and the other player controls just an Orchard, both orchards can produce green. These types of effects don't take into account the cost of abilities, however. If a player controls a Vivid Meadow with no charge counters and a Reflecting Pool, the Reflecting Pool could still produce a mana of any color because Reflecting Pool's ability doesn't care about how many charge counters it has, just about what types of mana Vivid Meadow can produce. Okay, remember the mana abilities that cause cards to move zones? Chromatic Sphere, Deranged Hermit, and Selvala Explorer Returned are all examples of these types of abilities. Well, there are some special rules for these. If a mana ability causes a card to move zones while players do not have priority, like casting a spell or during Declare Attackers or Declare Blockers steps, that card enters the new zone face down and nobody is allowed to look at it until a player receives priority. While it is face down, the characteristics of the card are not known. This means when you pay cost for casting a spell, if you activated Chromatic Sphere during the casting of the spell, you may discard this unknown card for something like Tormenting Voice, but you may not exile it to pay for Force of Will's alternate cost, because you have no way of knowing if it's blue or not. So, that's all you need to know about mana abilities. Always remember that a mana ability is an activated ability that produces mana, does not target, and is not a Planeswalker loyalty ability. This completes the lesson on mana abilities. Be sure to check back for more lessons at www.mysticaltutor.org.
Okay, since we're trying to speed up a little at this point, guys, we're going to jump right into the questions, and we'll try and answer other people's questions through chat. So, mana abilities questions. Number 1. Ashley controls only one forest, an Arbor Elf, and a 2/2 bear token. Nora controls a Ghostly Prison. So if Ashley wants to attack with the bear token, can she use the forest and the Arbor Elf to pay for the 2 mana? Okay, I'm seeing a couple no's, a couple yeses. So some people have correctly identified that Arbor Elf is indeed not a mana ability. It can't be activated in the time period when you want to use Ghostly Prisons, or you have to pay Ghostly Prisons 2 mana cost to let your creature attack. So during the Declare Attacker step, you have to choose. Ghostly Prison makes you pay a cost in order to attack, and you can't actually activate abilities such as Arbor Elf, which allows people to respond to it, since it's not a mana ability. If this were, say, an Elvish Mystic, this would be allowed, because this is not a mana ability. The Elvish Mystic, however, would be able to do this. You can't actually float the mana either. If you had mana floating, it would be possible if it didn't empty pre-combat to declare attackers. So it's not quite as simple as being able to float mana unless you had something out like Omnath or Upwelling and that sort of thing. But again, those are corner cases. Any questions on that? My audio seems to be cutting out. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, so just as the last thing, you do not actually get a chance to activate abilities or things before you declare attackers unless you do it in the pre-combat attack, in the attack phase. So you don't actually get the chance to activate abilities except for mana abilities to pay for costs on attackers. Okay, James, do you want to take question number 2? No response. Okay, I will just continue reading this. So, Austin casts Pithing Needle, and as it resolves, he names Metalworker. On Austin's end step, Nang activates the ability of Metalworker, but Austin says that he can't because it's being named by Pithing Needle and isn't a mana ability. Is Austin correct? Okay, I'm seeing mostly yes responses. Excuse me, that is a mana ability. This is true. So unfortunately, this time Austin's going to be very sad that he chose Pithing Needle, because Pithing Needle does not stop mana abilities, so that the Metalworker can still activate its ability. Yes, it is. It is still a mana ability, even if it fails to actually produce mana.
And for our final question, I believe this is the last one. Alan controls a Reflecting Pool, a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, a Mountain, and a Dragon Lord Dromoka. What colors of mana can the Reflecting Pool produce? So I've seen a lot of people say any color, and a couple people just say just green and white. Well, Nykthos can always produce mana of any color, and it is very similar to the Vivid Grove example. And remember, there is a mountain as well, but that's not important. The Nykthos can produce, even though the only permanent in play is Dragon Lord Dromoka, the mountain, but the mountain produces red mana, so can the Reflecting Pool. Squee. But the Nykthos has the ability to produce any color of mana, so therefore a Reflecting Pool is also able to, and I don't know how this Dragon Lord Dromoka got into play with only 3 lands, but that's unimportant. So the Nykthos Reflecting Pool combo works pretty well. And that is the last of our challenge questions. For the Chromatic Star, drawing a face-down card, essentially with that, since we're activating the mana ability of Chromatic Star during, let's say, the casting of a spell, we'll draw the card, but we won't be able to see what it is, and it'll have no rules text during that time. However, you can still use it to pay for other costs, such as Tormenting Voice. So, for example, you draw it face down to keep it hidden so that you don't have any information on it. Correct. The card has no rules text, but since we can pay, and this is more casting spells, which will be in another one of our live sessions. But essentially, since we activate mana abilities before we pay for the cost of a spell, you could discard that card, for example, to Tormenting Voice, which is the example they give in the Prezi. Any other questions? It would be in your hand. You can't pay for Force of Will with it because it still has no rules. Well, it has no rules text, so it wouldn't have color, if I remember correctly. This is quite corny. That's one I'm...
Jordan, yes, you will have to reveal every card you draw if you have the Courser out.